Her brother sold her. Not metaphorically. Not in some twisted emotional sense that people dress up in poetry to make it easier to swallow. He literally signed her name on a piece of paper, handed it to a man whose enemies disappeared without funerals, and walked away without looking back. Amara Ellison was 27 years old, standing in her own kitchen covered in bread flour, when two men in black suits knocked on her door and told her she had 48 hours to pack her life into suitcases. Her brother Daniel had lost $300,000 to the Moretti family, and since Daniel had nothing left to give, no money, no property, no dignity worth trading, he had offered the one thing he believed nobody would miss: his sister. The woman nobody wanted, anyway. If you've ever been treated like you don't matter by the very people who are supposed to love you most, stay with me. Because this story is about what happens when the world's most dangerous man sees something in you that your own family refused to. And before we go any further, if stories like this one speak to you, please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss what's coming next. Drop a comment right now and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where everything began to break, and where, impossibly, something began to heal. The morning. Daniel came to her apartment. Amara had been awake since 4. That was normal for her. Bakers didn't sleep the way regular people slept. They operated on a different clock, one that ran on yeast and oven heat and the particular silence of a city that hadn't started yelling yet. She had dough resting on the counter, a pot of coffee going on the stove, and an order of honey oat loaves due for pickup at 7. Her hands were already dusted white. Her hair was wrapped in a yellow scarf she'd had since college. She was humming something she couldn't name, half a song from childhood, the kind that exists only in memory and never quite comes back in full. When she heard the knock, she assumed it was her downstairs neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who sometimes came up early to steal coffee and complain about her knees. It was not Mrs. Patterson. Daniel stood in the hallway looking the way he always looked when he'd done something he couldn't take back. Shoulders up near his ears, eyes doing that thing where they focused on a spot just past her face instead of actually meeting her gaze. He was 41 years old and had never once in his life been able to look directly at the consequences of his own choices. Amara had known this about him since she was 9. She had spent most of her life forgiving it. "I need to talk to you," he said. She stepped back and let him in because that was what she did. That was what she had always done. She made space for people who had never once made space for her. He sat at her kitchen table and watched her pour coffee into 2 mugs without asking whether he wanted any. He was quiet for longer than felt normal, even for him, and that was when the first thread of real unease pulled at something in her chest. "Daniel," she set a mug in front of him. "What did you do?" It wasn't a question. It hadn't been a question since the time he'd gambled away their mother's car payment when Amara was 15, or the time he'd borrowed money from her savings to invest in something that evaporated inside of 3 weeks, or the time he'd showed up at her bakery, the one she'd spent 4 years building from a cart in a street market into an actual storefront with her name on the window, and asked her to sign over half the deed as collateral for a loan she never saw again. Every single time, it had started like this. Daniel sitting, Daniel not meeting her eyes, Daniel wearing the face of a man who already knew how bad it was and was simply waiting for the part where she absorbed it. "I got into some trouble," he said. "How much?" $300. She was quiet for a moment. $300? He didn't answer, and the silence told her everything. "Daniel," her voice went flat. $300,000. It wasn't supposed to go that far. The game was, there was a streak, and I thought I could get ahead of it, and then, "Who did you borrow from?" He picked up the coffee mug, put it down without drinking, picked it up again. "Daniel, who did you borrow from?" "The Moretti family." The kitchen went very, very quiet. Even the coffee seemed to stop making noise. Amara knew the name the way everyone in New York knew it. Not from headlines, because the Moretti family had people whose entire job was keeping their name out of headlines. You knew it the way you knew which streets to avoid at night, which corners had a particular kind of energy that made the back of your neck go tight. You knew it from whispers and careful silences, and the way certain conversations stopped the moment certain names were mentioned. Cassian Moretti, the man they called the Ghost, not because he was invisible, but because by the time you knew he was coming for you, you had already ceased to matter. Okay, she said, because what else was there to say? Okay, what's the plan? That's what I came to talk to you about. You have a plan. She exhaled slowly. You went to those people and you borrowed $300,000 and you already have a plan. There's a deal on the table. He finally looked at her. Not all the way, not quite, but close enough that she could see the particular shade of shame in his eyes that she'd learned to read like a language. They're willing to cancel the debt entirely. No interest, no collection, nothing. The whole thing disappears. What do they want? He didn't answer immediately. He reached across the table and wrapped both hands around the coffee mug, the way a person holds something they need in order to keep their hands still. You, he said. The word landed in the kitchen like a stone dropped into still water. Not violent, not loud, just impact. And then ripples spreading out from the center until they touched everything. Amara stood very still. Cassian Moretti needs a wife. Daniel spoke faster now, the way he always did when he was trying to fill silence before it could become accusation. It's a whole arrangement. The family elders want him married for appearances, for stability. He was widowed, and they need... It's an arranged thing. It's formal. He wants to buy me. It's not like that. My own brother is selling me to the Mafia. She said it out loud, quietly, like she was testing whether the words made any more sense when she heard them in the air. To cancel a debt, you ran up gambling. Amara, get out of my kitchen. If you don't agree, they'll get out. Amara, listen to me. If you say no, they will come for me. These are not people who accept no. I went to their table, I took their money, and now they are calling it in. And if I can't deliver... She turned around, faced the window above the sink. The city was starting to lighten outside, that gray pearl color it got just before the sun committed to showing up. Somewhere below on the street, a truck was making deliveries, the mechanical groan of a loading dock playing out in the ordinary dark. She thought about her bakery, the smell of it in the early morning, that particular warmth that was hers and no one else's, the product of years of work and failure and burnt batches and starting over. She thought about the 4 years it had taken her to get from a folding table at a street market to an actual storefront. She thought about the customers who knew her name, Mrs. Patterson buying rye bread every Thursday, the little boy who always asked for the loaf with the most seeds on top, the woman who ordered birthday cakes for her grandchildren and cried the first time she tasted the vanilla cream filling because it was the same recipe her own grandmother used to make. She had built something, out of nothing, out of herself, out of flour and patience and the particular stubbornness of someone who had been told their whole life that they weren't quite right, too big, too dark, too soft, too much, not enough, and had decided to build something beautiful anyway. And Daniel sat in her kitchen and asked her to hand it all over because he couldn't stop himself from sitting down at a table that was always going to take everything from him. How long have you known? She asked. Her back was still to him. About the debt? About the arrangement? About this deal? How long have you known they wanted me specifically? Silence. Daniel. 3 weeks. She closed her eyes. 3 weeks. He had known for 3 weeks. He had sat on this for 21 days, long enough that the Moretti family had already decided the answer was yes, long enough that there was probably no real negotiation left to be had, long enough that by the time he showed up at her door, the choice had already been made for her by people who did not know her name. And he had said nothing. He had come to her apartment, eaten her food, borrowed $40 for the train home, looked her in the face without once letting his expression crack, and said nothing. I didn't know how to tell you, he said. She didn't answer. Amara, if there was any other way, there's always another way. She turned around. Her voice was very calm. That particular calm that lives on the far side of something that should be rage but has burned so long it's turned into something quieter and more permanent. You just decided this was easier, because it's always easier when it's me. He opened his mouth. She raised one flour-dusted hand and he stopped. I need you to go, she said. I need you to walk out that door, and I need some time alone. And then, she breathed, and then I'll figure out what I'm going to do. He left. He didn't apologize. She hadn't expected him to. She stood in the kitchen for a long time after the door closed. The coffee went cold. The dough on the counter kept rising the way dough does, indifferent to everything, patient in its slow biological climb. She pressed both palms flat against the counter and looked at her hands. Thick hands. Working hands. Hands that had been making things since she was 7 years old, and her grandmother had first shown her how to fold dough. Hands that had been mocked. Her own family at holiday dinners. Look at Amara, still eating. Look at her hands, so doughy, like her bread. The laughter that was supposed to be affectionate but never quite was. She had learned to keep moving. That was the whole of her survival strategy, her entire life compressed into a single technique. Keep moving, keep making something, don't stop long enough for the cruelty to catch up. She looked at the rising dough, pulled the yellow scarf tighter around her hair. Then she started shaping the honey oat loaves because she had an order due at 7, and the world was still turning, and she was still here, and the one thing no one had ever been able to take from her was this. Her hands still knew what to do. The wedding happened 14 days later. Looking back, Amara would remember almost none of the preparation in any kind of linear order. It came at her in fragments. A woman arriving at her apartment with measuring tape and a rack of dresses and an expression of professional neutrality. So absolute, it was its own form of cruelty. A car that arrived each morning and waited outside regardless of whether she got in. Documents with her name already typed into spaces she had not signed yet. A lawyer who spoke quickly and used language designed to be technically clear and humanly incomprehensible. She was not asked her opinion on most of it. That was the part she kept returning to in the small hours when she couldn't sleep. Not the fear, which was real and constant and sat in her chest like a stone, but the administrative thoroughness of it. The way it was all organized around her absence. As if the most efficient version of this arrangement was one in which Amara herself was the least involved party. She did ask one question of the lawyer at the end of one of those early meetings. She asked whether she had any legal options, whether there was a path, any path, that didn't end with her standing in a church next to a man who had purchased her from her brother. The lawyer looked at her for a long moment. A human moment, the first one in the whole meeting. "Miss Ellison," he said carefully, "these are not people who appreciate complications." She understood what he meant. She thanked him for his time. She didn't sleep that night. She baked instead. 4 batches of sourdough, 2 pans of cornbread, a tray of cinnamon rolls that she left on Mrs. Patterson's doorstep before sunrise because she needed to give something to someone and she didn't know what else to do with her hands. On the morning of the wedding, she sat in a chair in a hotel suite while a woman she'd never met arranged her hair and another woman she'd never met applied makeup to her face, and she stared at the reflection in the mirror and tried to locate herself somewhere in it. She was wearing a dress that cost more than she'd made in her bakery in 6 months. Her hair was done in a way she'd never wear on her own. Her face looked like a version of herself that had been curated for someone else's approval. She thought about her grandmother's kitchen, the smell of it, that warm, yeasty, sweet smell that meant safety when nothing else did. She got in the car when they told her to. She walked down the aisle when the music started. She did not look at Cassian Moretti. Not directly. Not at first. She was aware of him the way you're aware of a sudden drop in temperature, as a fact of the environment, something your body registers before your mind catches up. Tall, dark-suited, completely still in a way that wasn't peace but discipline, the kind of stillness that costs something. She repeated the words they told her to repeat. She signed the documents they told her to sign. And then she was married. The reception was held in a ballroom large enough to make the 400 people inside it seem like a reasonable number. Amara stood at Cassian's side and smiled the smile she'd been perfecting since she was a child, the one that sat on the surface of her face and never touched anything underneath. She heard them, of course. She had always heard them. The particular acoustics of cruelty at formal events, voices angled just slightly too low to be addressed directly, laughter timed just after a glance in her direction. Look at her. Where did he find her? Is that really? She heard the word fat. She heard, somewhere behind her left shoulder, someone describe her as his charity case. She heard a woman with excellent diction ask another woman, in a voice that carried beautifully, whether Cassian had lost his mind along with his wife. She kept smiling. She kept moving. She lifted a glass of red wine from a passing tray because she needed something to do with her hands. What happened next was, by any measure, the most humiliating moment of her life. And she had a catalog of humiliating moments that stretched back to a birthday party at age 11 when her cousins had mocked her in front of her entire class. Her heel caught on the edge of the decorative carpet runner that led from the main table to the dance floor. She felt the floor tilt toward her before she could correct her balance. Her arm swung out instinctively, the motion of a person trying to catch themselves, and the glass in her hand completed a clean arc through the air. The entire glass, every drop of red wine, directly onto Cassian Moretti's white dress shirt and custom suit jacket. The ballroom went silent, not gradually, instantly, like someone had cut the power to every conversation simultaneously. 400 people held their breath. She looked up at him from the floor, where she'd managed to get one knee down to catch herself, one hand pressed flat against the marble. The wine was spreading across the white cloth of his shirt in a dark, irreversible bloom. His jaw was tight, his eyes were unreadable. The silence pressed in from every direction. She had time, in that moment, to think several things. She thought that this was how it ended before it began. She thought about the faces of the mafia men lining the walls, their absolute terrible stillness. She thought about Daniel, somewhere out there, living the life her compliance had purchased for him. She thought, I am so tired. And then Cassian Moretti crouched down, right there on the ballroom floor, in front of 400 people, in his ruined suit, and held out his hand. Not to take her by the arm, not to drag her up. He held it out the way you offer a hand to someone and wait for them to decide whether to take it. His voice was quiet. Quieter than she expected from a man everyone called the Ghost. Are you hurt? 3 words, that was all. She stared at him. He waited. He was patient about it, in a way that felt strangely private for a moment happening in front of 400 witnesses. No, she said. No, I'm not hurt. He helped her to her feet, handed her the handkerchief from his breast pocket without looking at the stains spreading across his shirt, turned back to the room with an expression so flat and absolute that every whispered conversation died before it could start. Nobody laughed. Nobody said a single word. And Amara stood there in her borrowed dress, with her borrowed face and her borrowed smile, holding a stranger's handkerchief, and felt the ground shift under everything she thought she understood about what was happening to her. She still didn't know who he was, but she knew that in that one moment, in that terrible silence, he had done the one thing no one in her life had ever reliably done. He had asked if she was okay, and he had waited for the answer. The handkerchief smelled like cedar and something colder that she couldn't name. Amara held it in her fist the entire ride from the venue to the Moretti estate, not because she needed it anymore, but because it was the only thing in the last 14 days that had been handed to her without a condition attached. She sat in the back of the car with 6 inches of leather seat between her and her new husband and watched the city disappear behind the tinted windows and thought about absolutely nothing, because thinking about anything at all felt like standing at the edge of something very high and looking down. Cassian didn't speak. She didn't know what she had expected. She had built a version of this man from whispers and fear and the particular way people's voices dropped when they said his name, and the man sitting beside her in the dark car didn't fit that shape exactly. He sat the way soldiers sat, the way people sat who had learned that stillness was a kind of armor. His hands rested on his thighs, loose and open, and he looked straight ahead at the partition between them and the driver, and the silence coming off him wasn't hostile. It was just complete, like a room with all the air taken out. She looked out her window. He looked at his partition. The city slid past. When the car turned through a gate and the estate resolved out of the dark, enormous, stone, lit from below by lights angled up into old ivy. She felt her stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with the motion of the car. A man opened her door. She got out. She stood on the gravel drive and looked up at the house and thought, I am never going to be warm in there. She was wrong about a lot of things that first night, but she wasn't wrong about that. The room they gave her was on the 2nd floor, east wing, and it was the kind of room that existed in houses where someone had spent a great deal of money making sure every surface communicated wealth without communicating anything personal. The bed was enormous. The furniture was pale and expensive. There were fresh flowers on the nightstand that someone had placed there recently enough that the water in the vase was still cold. She sat on the edge of the bed for a while in her wedding dress because the zipper was in a location that required either assistance or a degree of flexibility she didn't currently have, and she was not going to ask anyone in this house for help. Not tonight. Not yet. She eventually got the zipper down by wedging herself against the bedpost at an angle that would have looked completely unhinged to anyone watching. She hung the dress over the back of a chair because it didn't feel right to drop it on the floor, even though no part of her wanted it anymore. She changed into the clothes she'd packed, a soft shirt, cotton pants, the kind of clothes she wore when she was going to be awake before 5. She didn't sleep. She sat by the window with her knees pulled up and watched the grounds below in the dark, the security lights casting long shadows across the grass, and she told herself she was taking inventory. What she knew, what she didn't know, what the rules were. What she knew, she was here. She was not going anywhere. The arrangement was real and it was permanent, and the piece of paper she'd signed made it legal in every way the word legal could apply to something that had started as a debt settlement. What she didn't know, everything else. What the rules were, she had no idea, and that was the part that was going to be the problem. Morning came the way mornings did in houses she didn't belong in. Wrong light, wrong sounds, wrong smell. She found the kitchen at 5:43 after taking 2 wrong turns and ending up in what appeared to be a formal sitting room, and then a room that contained nothing but a billiard table and the particular silence of furniture that was never used. The kitchen was large enough to be a restaurant kitchen and was equipped accordingly, commercial-grade range. Double ovens. A refrigerator that could have stored enough food for 30 people, which, she would later learn, was not an exaggeration. A woman stood at the counter making coffee. 60s. Gray hair pulled back with the efficiency of someone who had been pulling their hair back efficiently for 40 years. She turned when Amara came in, and her expression ran through several calculations in about 2 seconds. "Mrs. Moretti," she said. The name landed wrong. Not painfully wrong, just like a coat that belongs to someone else. You can wear it. It doesn't fit. "Amara," she said. "Please." The woman studied her. "Elena, I manage the house." "Is there—" Amara looked at the commercial range. "Could I use the kitchen? I need to bake something." Elena's expression didn't change. "At 6 in the morning. I know it's early. I can wait if—" "I'll make you coffee," Elena said, and turned back to the machine, which Amara decided to take as permission. She didn't have her own supplies, obviously. She worked with what was in the pantry: flour, butter, sugar, salt, eggs, vanilla extract, a jar of cinnamon that had been opened recently enough that it still had its smell. She found a ceramic mixing bowl in a cabinet and a wooden spoon that was clearly decorative but would work. And she started with something simple because simple was all she had capacity for at 6 in the morning in someone else's kitchen after not sleeping. She made cinnamon bread. Not complicated, not impressive. The kind of thing you make when you need your hands to know where to go because the rest of you doesn't. Elena brought her coffee without being asked again. Set it on the counter beside her. Didn't speak. Went back to whatever she'd been doing. At 7:45, Amara pulled 2 loaves out of the oven and set them on the cooling rack. The kitchen smelled, genuinely smelled, for the first time since she'd walked into this house, like something that didn't have a dollar value. Elena appeared in the kitchen doorway, looked at the loaves, and her face did something small and almost involuntary. Not a smile exactly, something quieter. "He doesn't eat breakfast," Elena said. "Okay," Amara said. "He hasn't eaten breakfast in 4 years." Amara looked at the cooling loaves. "That's not why I made it." Elena was quiet for a moment. "I'll set out plates," she said. She didn't see Cassian for 3 days. This was not unusual, Elena explained, without being asked. He kept irregular hours. He spent most of his time between the East Wing office, locations she wouldn't have access to, and occasional appearances at the dining room table at hours that bore no relationship to conventional meal times. His schedule was not a schedule so much as a series of unpredictable returns to the house between other things. Amara learned the house instead. It took 2 days just to understand the geography of it. Which wings were staff areas, which rooms were locked, which hallways led somewhere, and which terminated in formal receiving rooms that appeared to have never received anyone. She kept a map in her head the way she kept recipes, by walking through them repeatedly until they were automatic. She found the memorial room on the afternoon of the 3rd day, which was not, she would later reflect, the most auspicious timing. She hadn't been looking for it. She had been looking for a laundry room, a reasonable objective since no one had told her where it was, and she had now been in the same house for 3 days wearing a rotating selection from one suitcase. She'd opened a door at the end of a corridor in the west wing that she'd assumed, based on the closed-off feeling of that part of the house, was storage. It was not storage. The room was medium-sized and painted a shade of ivory that might have been white once. It was full of light from two windows, both dressed in sheer curtains that diffused the afternoon sun into something gentle. And it was arranged, with great care, around a woman who was no longer alive. Photographs covered the walls. A framed wedding portrait, Cassian younger, less weathered, standing with a woman who had dark curling hair and a laugh you could read in a still image. More photos. The same woman on what looked like a coastline somewhere in Europe, her hair whipping sideways, mouth open mid-laugh. The same woman at a kitchen table, looking at whoever was holding the camera with an expression of such complete and private affection that Amara felt she was intruding on something that had nothing to do with her. There were other objects. A pair of gloves, very small, folded on a glass shelf. A collection of books arranged with deliberate attention. A crystal sculpture on a pedestal near the window. Abstract, maybe 15 inches high, catching the afternoon light in a way that scattered small rainbows across the floor. She stood in the doorway for a moment. She shouldn't have stood there. Then she stepped inside. Just a step. Just to look at the photograph on the far wall more closely. There was something in the composition of it, the particular way the light fell, that made it unlike the others. She didn't see the low table beside the pedestal. Her hip caught it as she turned to go. The crystal sculpture fell. She lunged for it, caught the base briefly, lost it again. It hit the floor and the sound it made was not a shattering. It didn't explode into pieces, which was the only mercy. But it cracked. A clean, irreversible fracture across the middle, and then the upper section slid off and broke against the floor into 3 additional pieces. She stood very still with the base still in her hand and looked at what had been a whole thing 4 seconds ago. She heard footsteps in the hallway, fast ones. The door opened. Cassian filled the frame. He'd been somewhere. His jacket was off, sleeves rolled up, a quality of disrupted motion about him like someone who'd been moving fast and stopped short. He looked at her, then at the floor, then at the broken pieces of crystal lying across the hardwood. The change in his face was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. It was the kind of stillness that happens when something goes inward instead of outward, when the pressure finds nowhere to go and so it goes into the jaw, the shoulders, the particular set of the eyes. "Get out of this room," he said. His voice was very quiet. That was what made it different. She had expected volume. There was no volume, just a register that somehow communicated that the quiet was not gentleness. "I'm sorry," she said. I was looking for the laundry room. I didn't know this was—" "Get out." She stepped into the hallway. He came forward and pulled the door shut behind him, and she had 1 second of watching his face before the door closed between them. 1 second of seeing something that she recognized, not because she knew him, but because she knew the expression. She had worn it herself, at 15, at 20, at 24, all the ages where something inside you has been hit in a place that doesn't heal cleanly, and people keep walking directly into the bruise without understanding why you keep flinching. She went to her room. She sat on her bed with her hands folded in her lap and waited for what came next. What came next was silence. He didn't come to her door. No one came to her door. The house went on with its business. She could hear Elena in the corridor below at some point, a door somewhere, ordinary sounds that had nothing to do with the fact that she had just broken something irreplaceable in the private shrine of a dead woman. She sat with it for an hour. 2. She was good at sitting with things. She had been trained by a lifetime of circumstances that did not resolve quickly. Then she got up. She went to the kitchen. She started making dinner because it was 7 o'clock and no one else was going to. She was plating the pasta when he walked in. He stopped in the doorway. She didn't turn around. She could see him in the dark window above the sink, the reflection, his shape in the kitchen light. He stood there for long enough that she wondered whether he was going to speak or simply stand there until she cracked. "You cook," he said. "I bake mostly, but I can cook." She carried 2 plates to the table. "Sit down if you want to eat." A pause. Then he came to the table and sat. She put a plate in front of him. She sat across from him. She served herself a portion she didn't particularly want and started eating because doing anything else was going to turn this into something she didn't have the energy for tonight. He picked up his fork, looked at the food, ate. She watched him from under her lashes because she wasn't going to stare openly at a man who had told her to get out of a room 2 hours ago, but she also needed to understand what she was working with here. He ate like someone who had forgotten that food was something you were supposed to have a relationship with, efficiently, without pleasure. She'd seen this before, people who ate to run the machine, not for any other reason. "I'm sorry about the sculpture," she said. "I'll pay for—" "You can't pay for it." "I know I can't literally pay for it. I meant, it's gone." His voice was flat. "It doesn't matter." She looked at him. "It clearly does matter." He looked up from his plate. It was the first time he'd really looked at her directly since the car, since the ballroom, since the handkerchief. His eyes were dark, and there was something in them that sat underneath everything else. Not anger, not grief exactly. Something older than both that had been living in him for long enough that he'd stopped noticing it. "My wife liked to make things," he said. "She learned to work glass one summer. That piece took her 6 months." Amara didn't say anything. "She gave it to me the week before she died." He looked back at his food. "I've had it for 5 years, and tonight it's on the floor in 3 pieces." "I know." She kept her voice level. "I know, and I'm sorry. It was an accident, and I understand if that doesn't help, but it was an accident." He didn't respond. He ate the rest of his dinner in silence, and she ate the rest of hers, and the kitchen did what kitchens do. Held the quiet without making it heavier than it already was. When he finished, he pushed back his chair, stood. "Thank you for the food," he said. "You're welcome." He left. She heard his footsteps go toward the study, and then a door closed, and the house settled back into its ordinary silence. She cleared the plates, washed them by hand even though there was a dishwasher, because washing dishes was something to do at a moment when she needed something to do. The warm water over her hands, the ordinary work of cleaning up after a meal. She was almost done when Elena appeared in the kitchen doorway, holding something. A single photograph. Framed. The one from the memorial room. The woman on the coastline, hair sideways, mid-laugh. "He took it out of the room," Elena said quietly. "I don't know where he put it, but he opened the West Wing corridor and walked out." She set the photograph on the counter. "He hasn't gone in that room in 2 months." Amara looked at the photograph. "She was beautiful," she said. "She was." Elena folded her hands. "She was also very difficult." A pause. "Not in a bad way. In the way some people are. They take up the space they're supposed to take." She argued with him. She won sometimes. He liked that. A beat. "He hasn't liked anything in a long time." Amara looked at the foam on the dishwater. "Why are you telling me this?" Elena was quiet for a moment. "Because you made bread on your first morning here, not because anyone asked you to, just because you needed to." She picked up a dish towel. "I thought you should know something about him in return, something fair." She set the towel down. "Don't let the house convince you there's no room for you in it." She left. Amara stood at the sink with wet hands and looked at the photograph of a woman who had known how to take up the space she was supposed to take, and felt, for the first time since the car ride and the gravel drive and the enormous cold bed, something loosened just slightly in the center of her chest. Not hope. Not yet. Just a crack in the certainty that everything here was only going to be hard. 2 weeks passed. She established a rhythm because rhythm was how she survived. Up at 5. Kitchen by 5:30. Baking until 7:30 or 8, depending on what she was making. She had ordered her own supplies. She'd been startled when Elena told her she could order anything she needed, and it would simply appear, startled again when the first delivery arrived, and it was exactly what she'd asked for. No questions, no accounting. And the kitchen gradually began to accumulate the particular archaeology of someone who actually used it. Her mixing bowls. Her preferred wooden spoon, which was not decorative. A set of loaf pans she'd brought from home. She learned his patterns the way you learn weather. He returned late. He left early. He sometimes didn't come home at all, and on those nights the house felt like it was exhaling. He ate when she left food. He didn't eat when she didn't, which she discovered by accident and which produced in her a complicated feeling she hadn't sorted out yet. He started appearing in the kitchen doorway while she baked, not coming in, not speaking, just there. She'd look up from whatever she was doing, and he'd be standing in the doorway with his jacket off and a glass of something dark in his hand, and an expression that was about as unreadable as a locked cabinet, and she'd look back at her dough and continue what she was doing, and after a while he'd be gone. The first time he came inside and sat down was a Thursday, 3 weeks after the wedding. She was making chocolate babka, the kind that required laminated dough and patience and multiple rest periods, and she was on the second fold when she heard the chair at the kitchen table scrape against the floor. She didn't look up. She kept folding. "What is that?" he said. "Babka, chocolate. How long does it take?" "About 4 hours total. I started at 6, she glanced at the clock. "Another hour and a half." Silence. Then, "Why do you start at 6? "Because that's when bakers start." "You're not running a bakery here." She lifted the dough, checked the even distribution of the butter layer, set it down again. "No," she said, "but I'm still a baker." He was quiet after that. He sat at the table with his glass, and she worked on the babka, and the kitchen was warm and the clock moved, and she became aware gradually that this was strange. That sitting in a kitchen at 7:30 in the morning with a man she'd been sold to, both of them saying very little, was strange and also, somehow, less bad than most things that had happened to her in the past month. "Do you miss it?" he said eventually. "The bakery." She kept her hands in the dough. "Every day." "What did you sell?" "I didn't sell it. I still own it technically. It's just—" She stopped. "I haven't been there. I don't know what's happening to it." "I could find out." She looked up at him then. He was looking at his glass. "Why would you do that?" she said. He didn't answer immediately. He turned the glass in his hand once, deliberate. "Because you baked bread on your first morning here, and you've baked every morning since, and you haven't once asked me for anything, and that is—" He stopped. "Unusual." She didn't know what to do with that exactly, so she went back to the babka. "It's called Ellison's," she said. "It's on Carver Street. I opened it 4 years ago. It started as a cart at the Lenox Market, and I saved for 2 years to afford the lease." She smoothed the top layer of dough. "I have 5 employees. Had. I don't know what they've done without me. I'll find out," he said again. And the strange part was, she believed him. The information came back in 36 hours. Elena brought it to her in the kitchen in the form of a folded piece of paper, the way information moved in this house, without digital trail, without explanation, appearing when it appeared. Amara unfolded it at the counter while her morning bread was in the oven. The bakery was still open. Her employees had kept it running. Marcus, who'd been with her since the cart days, had stepped into the gap without being asked. They were short on her specific recipes, working off what they knew from watching her, and the lemon tarts weren't right because no one else knew the exact temperature she used for the curd, but the bread was good and the coffee was good and the line was still going out the door every morning. She read the whole page twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her shirt pocket and stood with her hand over it for a moment. When Cassian appeared in the kitchen doorway that evening, she looked at him directly. "Thank you," she said. He acknowledged it with a nod that was small and almost awkward, the kind of nod that sits on someone who isn't used to being thanked without an agenda attached. He started to turn away. "They're managing," she said. "Marcus is running it." He stopped. "Good. He's using the wrong oven temperature for the lemon curd." She didn't know why she said it. "You can't rush lemon curd. It needs time at low heat or it breaks." She looked at the cooling rack. "Everything needs time at low heat or it breaks." He turned back and looked at her for a long moment. Something passed across his face that wasn't any one readable emotion but was made of several, and then it was gone, and he was the locked cabinet again, and he turned and left. But the next morning, there was a new sheet of paper on the kitchen counter. A note, short, in handwriting that was angular and contained no unnecessary curves. It said, "Tell me the temperature. I'll make sure Marcus gets it." She stood at the counter in the early morning with the smell of rising dough around her and the note in her hand, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, like someone was paying attention, not because they had to, not because she was useful, just paying attention. She wrote the temperature on the back of the paper and left it where he'd find it. The thing about grief that people didn't tell you. Amara thought about this on the night that changed everything, replaying it later in the dark of her room, was that it didn't always look like sadness. Sometimes it looked like control. Like a man who kept every room of himself ordered and armored, because the one time he'd let something in without planning for it, it had destroyed him on its way out. She had not planned to go back to the West Wing, but she was looking for the source of a draft she'd noticed near the corridor wall. There was a window somewhere that wasn't sealed correctly, and it was letting cold air into the hallway, and she'd noticed it twice and was in the particular mood that required her to find the problem and fix it rather than let it sit. And she went down the West Wing corridor, meaning to check the window at the end. She passed the door to the memorial room, and it was open. Not wide, just ajar. Maybe 2 inches. She should have kept walking. She knew she should have kept walking. The window was another 30 feet down the corridor, and the rational thing, the self-preserving thing, was to go to the window and fix the draft and go back to her room and not do the thing she was about to do. She pushed the door open. The room was emptier. That was the first thing. The photographs were still on the walls, but the glass shelves, the ones that had held the small personal objects, were cleared. The pedestal where the crystal sculpture had stood was gone. The room felt like a space that had been in the process of being packed away and then stopped partway through, like someone had started a task and then lost the certainty to finish it. Cassian was sitting in the single chair in the corner. He was not doing anything. He was just sitting, in the near dark, with the door open 2 inches and the corridor light making a thin, bright line across the floor. He had his elbows on his knees and his hands loose between them, and he was staring at something on the far wall with the look of a man who had been in this room long enough that he'd stopped seeing it. He looked up when she pushed the door open. His face went through several things in rapid succession and landed on none of them. She stood in the doorway. "I'm sorry. I wasn't—" The door was open. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked back at the wall. She should have left. She stayed. She came in and she sat down on the floor. There wasn't another chair. And she sat across from him with her back against the wall and her knees drawn up, and she said nothing. Because she didn't have anything to say that wasn't going to be wrong, and sometimes not saying the wrong thing was the only right option. He looked at her sitting on the floor. The expression on his face was something she couldn't fully read. Not quite startled, not quite angry, something off to the side of both. "She would have found that funny," he said. "What?" "You sitting on the floor." He looked back at the wall. She always said the floor was the most honest piece of furniture in a room. If you're sitting on the floor, you're not performing anything. Amara thought about that. She sounds like someone worth knowing. She was. A pause. She was also infuriating. She'd argue anything, win half of it, lose the other half, and claim she'd won that too. Something almost happened at the corner of his mouth. I never told her she was right. I should have. People think there'll be more time. I knew what I was. His voice didn't change, but there was something underneath it. I knew what this life meant for the people around me. She knew too. We both knew, and You make bargains with yourself. You say, "I'll keep her safe. I'll keep the danger away as long as I'm careful enough." He turned his glass in his hands. She hadn't noticed until now that he'd been holding a glass the whole time. "I wasn't careful enough." Amara sat with that. Let it be what it was. Didn't feel it. "It wasn't your fault," she said. "You don't know that." "No," she said. "But I know you've decided it was. And I know the difference between something true and something someone decided." He looked at her. Really looked at her, the way he almost never did. Direct, unhurried, like he was checking whether she meant it or was simply filling silence with acceptable sounds. "Why are you still in this house?" he said. "What?" "You have access to a car. You have—" He stopped. "You could leave." She was quiet for a moment. "Where would I go?" "Anywhere." "Daniel is still out there. The debt is canceled. Has been since the day we married." He held her gaze. "The arrangement protected you from that. The debt is gone. If you left, there would be no collection." She heard this. She processed it carefully, the way you process something that rearranges a basic assumption you've been operating on. "You're telling me I'm not trapped here," she said slowly. "I'm asking why you're still here." She looked around the room. The empty shelves, the photographs, the light from the corridor making that thin line across the floor. "Because I made bread on the first morning," she said finally. "And you found out about the wrong oven temperature for the lemon curd. And no one in my life has ever done something like that without wanting something back." She looked at him. "And I want to know what you are when you're not what everyone says you are." The room was very quiet. He looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at the wall again. When he spoke, his voice was different, lower, like something that had been held at a distance for a long time and had, without announcing its intention, taken one step closer. "She would have liked you," he said. Amara didn't say anything. She sat on the floor in the honest place a floor provides and let that sentence do what it needed to do. Neither of them spoke again for a while. The house breathed around them. Somewhere below, Elena was moving through the kitchen, the ordinary sound of someone at home in a house, and the thin line of corridor light lay across the floor, and Cassian Moretti sat in the chair where he came when grief got too heavy to carry standing up. And Amara sat on the floor and didn't leave. She didn't go anywhere. And that, she would think later, was the point where the door she hadn't known she was walking towards swung open. Not gently, not with any kind of grace, but with the sudden, irreversible certainty of something that had been waiting a long time to move and had finally decided now was. The morning after she sat on the floor of the memorial room, Amara woke up before her alarm and lay in the dark for a full minute trying to locate the feeling that was sitting in her chest. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't relief. It was something quieter and more unsettling than either of those. The particular vertigo of realizing that the map you've been using to navigate a place is wrong. Not wrong in the way that gets you lost. Wrong in the way that means you've been navigating somewhere different than you thought, and you're going to have to draw a new map from scratch. She got up. She went to the kitchen. She started bread. Cassian was already gone when she came downstairs. She knew this not because anyone told her, but because the house had a different quality when he was in it. A kind of atmospheric pressure, subtle, like a change in weather that you register in your joints before you register it consciously. When he was gone, the house relaxed into itself. When he was home, everything in it was faintly, continuously aware of where he was. She had started to be aware of where he was. She noticed this the way you notice you've developed a habit. After the fact, once it's already running on its own. She shaped the dough into rolls rather than a loaf because rolls finished faster, and she had an idea. She wrote a note on the back of a grocery receipt while the rolls were proofing, the kind of note that looked casual and wasn't. Marcus, the lemon curd needs to rest in the double boiler at 160, not higher. Pull it when it coats the back of a spoon. Don't rush it. She left it on the counter where Elena would find it and arrange for it to travel. She was loading the rolls into the oven when she heard voices in the front hall. Not the ordinary voices of the house staff, sharper than that, male, carrying the specific register of men who were accustomed to being heard in rooms whether or not they wished to be. She stayed in the kitchen. 30 minutes later, Elena appeared in the doorway with an expression Amara had learned to read as controlled concern. "There are men here," Elena said, "from the syndicate elders. They're asking to meet you." Amara didn't move from the counter. "Why?" "To assess the marriage. It's standard. They do it at 30 days. Elena folded her hands. "Mr. Moretti is not here." "When will he be back?" "He didn't say." Amara looked at the oven, at the rolls inside, at the timer she'd set. She untied her apron and folded it over the counter edge and straightened her shirt. "Where are they?" she said. There were 3 of them in the formal receiving room. Old men, not elderly but seasoned, the kind of old that comes from surviving things rather than simply from years. They sat in a configuration that was not quite a panel and not quite a social arrangement, the specific geography of men who were used to being the ones who decided things. The one in the center was named Vitelli. She gathered this from the way the other 2 oriented their bodies toward him, the small gravitational shifts of deference. He had white hair and a face that had settled into permanent assessment, like he'd stopped distinguishing between looking at people and evaluating them years ago. She sat down across from them without being invited to. Vitelli looked at her the way she'd been looked at her entire life. Not like a person, but like a quantity. Something to be measured against an expectation and found adequate or inadequate. "Mrs. Moretti," he said, "you're younger than I expected." "I'm 27, she said. "I don't know what you expected." "We expected Cassian to choose someone with more—" He paused. The pause was deliberate. "Experience in this environment." "He didn't choose me," she said. "Neither did I choose this. I think we both know that." Vitelli's eyes sharpened by about 2 degrees. The men on either side of him shifted fractionally. "The arrangement," Vitelli said, "requires certain things of the woman in this position. Stability, discretion. an understanding of what this family represents and what it requires of its members. And you're here to find out whether I understand those things. We're here to ensure the household is functioning appropriately. The household is functioning fine. She kept her hands in her lap. Still. Mr. Moretti eats regularly. The staff is well managed. The house is maintained. She met Vitelli's gaze. If what you're asking is whether I'm a problem, the answer is no. What we're asking, Vitelli said, leaning forward slightly, is whether you understand the nature of what you have married into. This is not a domestic arrangement. This is a position. It has implications. And the woman in this position cannot be— He looked at her, unhurried, taking his time. A liability. The word landed the way he intended it to, precise and cold and designed to communicate a category, not just a concern. Liability. A thing that costs more than it produces. A miscalculation. She had heard versions of this her entire life. Her own family had a dozen ways of saying the same thing. You are not what we needed. You are not what we planned for. You are the version of things that requires explanation. She had learned, over 27 years, that the people who said this to her were almost always telling you more about their own fear than about your actual value. The difference was that this man's fear came with the kind of infrastructure that made it dangerous. I understand the nature of what I've married into, she said. Do you understand the nature of what I am? Vitelli's expression didn't change, but he waited, which meant she'd caught something. I am not a liability, she said. I am a woman who has been running a business for 4 years in a neighborhood where nobody expected her to last 6 months. I kept 5 people employed. I built something from nothing with my own hands. She paused. I am the last person you need to worry about being a liability. The room was quiet. Vitelli looked at her for a long time. Then he sat back, slowly, and the temperature of the room shifted by a degree or two in a direction she couldn't quite name. We'll see, he said. It wasn't a concession. It wasn't an approval. It was the particular verdict of a man who had suspended judgment, not because he'd been convinced, but because he needed more data. She recognized it. She'd gotten the same verdict from bank loan officers and commercial landlords, and everyone who'd ever made her prove herself before they decided whether she was worth their time. She stood up. She nodded, once. She left the room. She went directly back to the kitchen and took the rolls out of the oven 40 seconds before the timer went off because she could smell exactly where they were, and she did not need a timer to tell her, and she stood over them on the cooling rack and breathed through her nose until her hands stopped wanting to shake. She told Cassian about the meeting that evening. He came in at 8, later than usual. He stopped in the kitchen doorway the way he did now. It had become the habit, the pattern, the gravitational return. And she turned from the stove and said without preamble, Vitelli was here today with 2 others. They called it a 30-day assessment. His face did something she recognized now as his version of a controlled response. The jaw, the shoulders, the slight forward weight redistribution of someone who's just heard something they needed to address but wasn't going to address at full velocity in the first 3 seconds. What did they say? He said. They called me a potential liability. She turned back to the stove. I told them they were mistaken. Silence behind her. Then, what exactly did you say? That I'd built a business from nothing, that I knew how to run things, that they didn't need to worry about me. She heard him come into the kitchen, come fully in, not just the doorway. She heard the chair at the table move. Vitelli doesn't make social calls, he said. If he came here, he was taking a position. I know. She ladled soup into 2 bowls. I'm not naive about what that means. He doesn't like you being here. He doesn't like anything about this situation that he didn't approve in advance. She brought the bowls to the table and sat across from him. That's a him problem, not a me problem. Cassian looked at her across the table. Something in the look was different from earlier weeks. More direct, less performing distance, like a man who had gradually stopped rehearsing being somewhere. He has influence, Cassian said. I know. He could make this— Cassian, she picked up her spoon. I have been dealing with men who didn't think I was the right kind of person my entire life. Vitelli is just a more expensive version of everyone who told me my bakery wasn't going to last. She looked up. I'm still here. The bakery's still open. I'm going to be fine. He watched her, then he picked up his own spoon. They ate. And that would have been the end of that particular night, except that Cassian, when he'd finished his soup and was sitting with his cup of coffee going cold in front of him. The way his coffee always went cold because he forgot to drink it, said something she hadn't expected. "There's something I want to show you," he said. "Tomorrow morning, if you're willing." She looked at him. "What is it?" "Your bakery." Her hands went still on the table. "It's still yours," he said. "It never stopped being yours. But I made some arrangements. I want to show you what they are before you hear about them from someone else." She heard the last part of that sentence more than the first. Before you hear about them from someone else, which meant there were arrangements, which meant he had done something and was choosing to tell her directly rather than let her discover it. And she was not sure yet whether that was good or something else, but she knew that the distinction mattered. "Okay," she said, "show me." Carver Street at 7 in the morning was exactly as she had left it, and completely different, and both of those things were true simultaneously. The line was there. That was the first thing she saw, and the thing that hit her somewhere deep and specific. The line, going out the door and around the corner, the same ordinary collection of people she'd been feeding for 4 years. Mrs. Okafor with her tote bag. The construction crew that came in before their shift. The teenagers who technically shouldn't have been out yet, but were, buying sweet rolls and conducting whatever social business teenagers conducted at 7 a.m. on a weekday. And the storefront. The sign was new. Not dramatically different, the same font, the same name, but it had been repainted, cleaned, the awning replaced. The front windows were clear. There were new display cases visible through the glass, and she could see from here that they were the good kind, the kind with proper temperature control that she'd always wanted and never been able to afford. She stood on the sidewalk and looked at it. "I bought the building," Cassian said behind her. "The lease was due to expire in 3 months. The landlord was planning to substantially increase the rent." A pause. "It's in your name. The deed is in your name." She turned around. He was standing 2 feet away with his hands in his jacket pockets and an expression that was working hard not to be readable. "You bought me a building," she said. "I bought you your building." He looked at the storefront. "There's a difference." She looked back at the sign, her name on it, her name on the deed of the building it was painted on. "The new display cases," she said. "Standard equipment for a commercial bakery. They should have been there from the beginning." The awning. "It was damaged." Cassian. "It was damaged," he said again. "Wind damage from February. It needed to be replaced." She looked at him for a long moment. He was looking at the building, not at her, and she could see in the line of his jaw the particular quality of someone who had done a thing and wasn't sure if it was going to land right, and wasn't accustomed to the feeling of not knowing. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. "Once." She went inside. Marcus was behind the counter, and the look on his face when he saw her, the absolute, uncomplicated relief of it, made her eyes do something she hadn't given them permission to do. She got behind the counter and hugged him before he could say anything, and he hugged her back with both arms the way her brother had not once in her adult life. And she stood there for a second and breathed in the smell of her own bakery, her cinnamon, her vanilla, her particular blend of flowers. And she was fine. She was completely fine. "Lemon curd temperature," Marcus said into her shoulder. She laughed. It came out slightly wrong, the way laughing does when it's sitting too close to other things, but it came out. "I know," she said. "I sent a note. We've been doing it wrong for 2 months. I know. I'm sorry." She pulled back and looked at her kitchen, and it was right, and it was hers, and she felt, for the first time in 2 months, like a person who existed in a place that was actually meant for her. She worked for 3 hours, made the lemon curd herself while Marcus watched and took actual written notes this time. Showed the 2 new hire staff members, young women, 20s, quiet and quick, the particular technique for the honey glaze that didn't set right if you applied it too early. Stood at her own counter with her own tools and felt her hands remember what they were for. Cassian sat at the corner table the entire time. He had a coffee he didn't drink, and he read documents. He always had documents, some kind of ongoing administrative reality that followed him everywhere. And he didn't interact with anyone, and nobody in the bakery approached him, which she suspected had less to do with his reputation and more to do with the 2 men who had positioned themselves near the door in a way that managed to look both casual and completely impenetrable. When she finally came out from behind the counter, her apron off and her hands washed and the morning rush winding down, she brought him a slice of lemon tart that she'd made from the corrected curd. He looked at it, then at her. "Try it," she said. He ate it with a fork, one bite, careful and deliberate. He was quiet for a moment. "It's good," he said. "I know." She sat down across from him. "Everything I make is good." Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one, the structural beginning of the possibility of a smile. She filed that away. 3 weeks after the bakery visit, the first threat arrived. She didn't know it was a threat at first. It came in the form of 2 men she didn't recognize sitting in the bakery at a table near the window for 3 consecutive mornings, ordering coffee each time and nothing else, and staying for exactly 40 minutes before leaving together. The first morning she thought nothing of it. The second morning she noticed the pattern. The third morning she looked at the larger of the 2 men and found him already looking at her, and the look was the kind that isn't curiosity. She told Marcus to call the number Elena had given her for non-emergency concerns. 30 minutes later, one of Cassian's men, a quiet person named Reyes, whom she'd seen twice before, once in the front hall and once near the estate gate, came to the bakery and looked at the 2 men at the window table and then left without speaking to her. That evening, Cassian came home earlier than usual. He went to his study rather than the kitchen. She waited 20 minutes and then went to the study door and knocked. "Come in." She came in. He was behind the desk with the particular quality of compressed motion that meant he'd been still in the body but not in the head for a while. "Who are they?" she said. "Sit down." "Cassian, please sit down." She sat. He looked at her for a moment and she could see him running the calculation. How much, how direct, how much context was required for her to understand what she was actually being told. "There's a rival family," he said. "The Duvant. They've been—" He stopped. "There's been a territorial situation for some time. It's been managed, but recently they've changed strategy. They're watching my bakery. They're watching you." He said it without softening it, which she appreciated. "You are, by being here, by being associated with this family, you are a point of access that didn't exist before. They're assessing whether that access is viable." "Viable meaning what?" "Meaning whether taking you would cost me enough to be worth the risk." The room was very quiet. "Would it?" she said. He looked at her across the desk. Something in his face was doing the things she'd come to recognize as him deciding how honest to be. Not whether to lie exactly, but how much of the truth to present without the architecture he normally built around it. "Yes," he said. She processed that. One word, the implications of it. "So what happens now?" she said. "Security at the bakery doubles. You don't travel without an escort. I'm adjusting the routes you use." He paused. "And you don't go anywhere alone until this is resolved." "How long will that take to resolve?" "I don't know yet." She nodded slowly, stood up, walked to the door. "Amara." She turned. He looked at her from behind the desk, and for a second, just 1 second, the architecture was completely gone, and he was simply a man looking at a woman he had put in danger by existing and knowing it. "I'm going to fix this," he said. "I know," she said, and she meant it, which was its own strange thing to mean. The attack came on a Tuesday morning in October when the light was thin and cold and the line outside the bakery stretched to the corner, and Amara was in the middle of pulling the second batch of morning bread from the oven. She heard it before she understood what she was hearing, a sound from the front of the bakery that was wrong in a frequency she'd never heard before, a quality of disruption that was not a dropped tray or a knocked-over display stand, something heavier, something that made the 2 women on her staff go very still in the way animals went still. Then Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway, and his face was doing something she had never seen it do. "Back door," he said. "Now." "What?" "Amara, back door." She moved. She went toward the back, and she heard the front door hit the wall. Not open, hit. And she heard voices, several of them, and she heard the sound of the 2 men who'd been stationed near the entrance doing what they'd been stationed there to do. And then she heard a shot. She stopped moving. In the kitchen. Flour on her hands, bread on the rack behind her, the back door 12 feet away. She heard the sounds of the front of the bakery, the display cases hitting the floor, the scatter of ceramic, a voice shouting in a language she didn't speak, another voice responding. She heard one of her staff members make a sound she was not going to think about directly right now. She looked at the back door. 12 feet. Maybe less. She looked at the cast iron skillet hanging on the hook by the range. She had been afraid her entire life. She had been afraid of her brother's decisions and her family's cruelty, and the word no from bank loan officers, and the particular cruelty of strangers who looked at her and decided she was a category before she was a person. She had been afraid in the car on the way to the estate, and she had been afraid in the cold bed on the first night, and she had been afraid in Vitelli's receiving room. She was afraid now. She was profoundly, physically afraid, in the way where your body wants to make itself small and still and invisible. She grabbed the skillet. The first man came through the kitchen door fast and low, and she swung before she thought about it. She had no training, no technique, no plan, just 32 ounces of cast iron and 4 years of lifting heavy commercial baking equipment. And the skillet connected with the side of his knee with a sound that was entirely different from anything she wanted to think about. He went down. She grabbed 2 of the large flour sacks, the 50-pound bags she'd been complaining about to Marcus for a year because the delivery company always stacked them too high. And she didn't throw them so much as drop them directly onto the second man coming through the door, which was inelegant but effective in the sense that it buried him to the shoulders in white powder and took him long enough to clear his vision that she was already moving. She went for the fruit pies on the cooling rack, not because she planned it, because they were there and they were hot. She'd pulled them 20 minutes ago. And the third man was between her and the back door, and she had to do something. She threw 2 of them. The third she held in application. He screamed. She ran. She was through the back door and into the alley, and her hands were covered in scalding fruit filling and flour, and she was shaking in a way that was going to require addressing later, and she stopped running after 20 feet because her legs were doing something wrong, and she had to lean against the alley wall and breathe. That was where Cassian found her. She heard the car before she saw it, the fast stop, the door, the footsteps. And then he was in the alley, and he stopped 2 feet from her and looked at her. All of her. The flour, the fruit filling on her hands, the cast iron skillet she was still somehow holding, the state of her. Behind him, through the open back door of the bakery, she could hear his men moving through the space, quick and systematic, the sounds of people doing a job they knew how to do. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked past her, into the bakery, where 3 men who had come in armed and organized were incapacitated in her kitchen. She watched something happen in his face that she had never seen there before. It started somewhere around the jaw, moved through the eyes, and ended in a sound she was not prepared for. He laughed. Not a small sound, not polite or controlled. A real laugh, the full-body kind. The kind that comes from somewhere so far down that it bypasses everything you've built to contain yourself. And it came out of Cassian Moretti in the alley behind her bakery while she stood against the wall covered in flour and peach filling. And it was so completely at odds with everything she knew about him that she just stared. He laughed for longer than was reasonable given the circumstances. Then he brought one hand up to his face, pressed it over his mouth, looked at her again, and laughed again. "A skillet," he said. "It was right there. And the flour. They couldn't see. And the pies." He looked at the skillet in her hand. "You hit a professional with a fruit pie." "I hit him with 2, she said. "The third one I sort of pressed." He looked at her. His eyes were... She had never seen his eyes look like that. Like something in them had been locked for a very long time and had just, without announcement, without planning, simply opened. He crossed the 2 feet between them and he kissed her. Not tentative, not asking permission, just certain, the way he was certain about most things. Except that this certainty was warm and it had nothing to do with authority and everything to do with a man who had spent 5 years being very sure that nothing was ever going to reach him again and had just been proven wrong by a woman in an apron holding a cast iron skillet. She kissed him back. Her flour-covered hands and her fruit-filled palms and the skillet she was still somehow gripping. Behind them, in the ruined bakery, someone said something in Italian. Neither of them heard it. The warmth lasted exactly 11 days. 11 days in which something in the estate changed. The light in it, the temperature, the way rooms felt when she walked through them. 11 days in which Cassian came home at reasonable hours and sat in the kitchen while she baked and told her things about his childhood in measured doses, the way you give someone something fragile a piece at a time. 11 days in which she learned that he'd grown up in this house with a father who spoke in commands and an uncle who spoke in principles, and the space between those two things had shaped him into someone who understood power and was deeply, privately uncertain about whether he'd ever deserved it. 11 days in which she told him about her grandmother's kitchen, about learning to bake at 7 years old, about the particular smell of the house on Sunday mornings and the way her grandmother would hum while she worked, half a song that Amara had been trying to remember in full for 20 years, 11 days. And then Reyes came to the kitchen at 6:45 in the morning with an expression that had no good news in it. She was in the middle of shaping dough. She looked up. Reyes looked at her and then past her, at a point on the wall, and said, "I need to speak to Mr. Moretti. He's in the study. He's going to want you present for this." Something in his voice, not the tone, but the weight underneath it, the quality of someone carrying information that they wish they were not carrying, made her hands go still on the dough. She washed her hands. She followed Reyes to the study. Cassian was behind the desk. He looked at Reyes' face and his own went very still. "Sit down," Reyes said to both of them, which was a thing Reyes had never done before, given an instruction in this house to either of them. And the fact that he did it now told her something important about what was coming. She sat. Cassian stayed standing. Reyes set a phone on the desk, screen up, and on it was a photograph that she looked at for 3 full seconds before her brain assembled what her eyes were seeing. Her brother, Daniel, sitting at a table, across from a man she had seen once, in a photograph. In the file Cassian had shown her during the Duvante conversation. Luca Duvante, the head of the rival family, sitting at a table together, in what appeared to be a restaurant, low light, leaning toward each other with the body language of people who were not meeting for the first time. Timestamped 9 days ago. "We've had surveillance on Duvante for 3 months, Reyes said. "We pulled this yesterday. We ran identification on everyone in the frame." A pause. "Your brother has been meeting with Duvante's people for 6 weeks. The first meeting was 2 weeks before the bakery attack." She heard this. She heard every word of it and understood every word of it, and the understanding moved through her slowly, the way cold water moves through a system. Not a shock, but a spread, reaching everything. Daniel had known. He had known the attack was coming. He had known because he had told Duvante's people, when she would be there, what her routine was, which entrance was least secure, where her guards were positioned. He had sold her, again. "The security leak," Cassian said. His voice was very quiet. The quiet that was not gentleness. "The daily schedule. They knew her route. They knew the shift change. All from him," Reyes said. "We have 3 separate meeting records. The last one was the day before the attack." The room was very quiet. Amara sat in the chair with her hands in her lap and looked at the photograph of her brother leaning across a table toward the man who had sent armed people into her bakery on a Tuesday morning in October. And she felt something happening inside her that was not grief, and was not rage, and was not any emotion she had a clean word for. It was older than all of those things, and it had been building for so long that it didn't come as a wave. It arrived like a door closing. Cassian's hand came down on the desk. Not a strike. Controlled, deliberate, the hand of someone who needed to put force somewhere, or it was going to go somewhere worse. "I know where he is," he said. Not to her, to Reyes. "Get the car." "Cassian." Her voice came out steadier than she expected. He looked at her. His eyes were the eyes of the man she'd heard about before she knew him. Flat and absolute and running the specific arithmetic of someone who had already decided on an outcome and was now simply organizing the logistics. "He tried to have you killed," Cassian said. "I know." "He gave them your schedule. He told them how to get to you. He did it for money." Each sentence came out separate and precise. His own sister, twice. "I know." She stood up, slowly. "I know what he did." "Then you know what happens now." She looked at him across the desk, her brother's face on the phone screen between them, the thin morning light coming through the study windows. "I want to talk to him first," she said. "Amara, I want to face him myself." Her voice didn't waver. "Before anything else happens. I want to look at him, and I want him to look at me, and I want to say what I need to say." Cassian held her gaze. The arithmetic in his eyes was running very fast. I'll arrange it, he said. She nodded. She picked up the phone from the desk and looked at her brother's face in the low-light restaurant photograph. The face she'd known since she was born, the face she'd forgiven more times than she could count, the face that had looked at her across her own kitchen table and told her she was being sold and then looked away. And she set the phone back. They brought Daniel to the estate at 2 in the afternoon. Amara knew the exact moment the car came through the gate because she felt it in the house. The particular shift in atmospheric pressure that preceded something arriving that could not be unarrived. She was in the kitchen. She had been in the kitchen since 7 in the morning. She had made 3 batches of bread she didn't need, a tray of shortbread cookies she wasn't going to eat, and was currently folding butter into a laminated dough for pastry that would take 2 more hours to finish and that nobody had asked for. Her hands needed to be doing something. If her hands were doing something, the rest of her could hold still. Reyes appeared in the kitchen doorway at 2:12. "He's here." She set the dough down, covered it with a cloth, washed her hands at the sink with the methodical attention of someone performing a ritual rather than a practical task, dried them, untied her apron and hung it on the hook by the range. She walked to the door Reyes indicated, which was not the formal receiving room and not the study, but a room she hadn't been in before, windowless or nearly, with a single overhead light and furniture that had been chosen for utility and not comfort, a table, 4 chairs. The kind of room that said, without saying it, that what happened here was not social. Daniel was already seated. He looked like a version of himself that had been left in water too long. The shape was the same, but something structural had softened. He was thinner than the last time she'd seen him, which had been 6 weeks ago when he'd come to the estate and spent 40 minutes in the kitchen eating her food and telling her nothing. His eyes went to her when she came in, and they did the thing she'd spent a lifetime reading, the lateral drift, the almost meeting, the perpetual failure to land. She sat across from him, folded her hands on the table, waited until the door closed behind Reyes. The silence went on long enough that it became its own kind of statement. "Amara," Daniel said, "don't." She said it quietly. "Whatever you were going to say first, don't." He closed his mouth. She looked at him. She looked at him the way she'd never let herself look at him before. Not with the soft focus of family, not with the automatic forgiveness she'd spent her whole life preloading before he even needed it, but clearly. The way you look at something when you finally stop deciding in advance what you're going to see. He looked like a man who knew exactly what he'd done. "You gave them my schedule," she said. "It wasn't—" He stopped, started again. "I didn't think they were actually going to— Daniel. I thought it was just information. That they wanted to know your movements for leverage, not that they were going to send people in. You gave the men who tried to kill me the exact time I would be alone in my kitchen." She kept her voice level. Not because she wasn't feeling things, because she had decided, in the kitchen while folding dough at 7 in the morning, that she was going to walk into this room and she was going to say what she needed to say, and she was not going to give him the satisfaction of watching her fall apart. You gave them the shift change time. You told them which entrance. You took money from the family of a man who wanted to use me against my husband, and you did it while sitting at my table eating my food. He didn't say anything. "How much?" she said. "Amara, Chet, how much did he pay you?" A pause, barely a pause. 50,000. She absorbed that, sat with it. $50,000. The price of her life, in her brother's accounting, was $50,000, which was not even the cost of one of the display cases in her bakery. "The first time," she said, "you sold me to cancel a debt. I understood the math, even if I hated it. You were desperate and you were scared and you chose the option that cost you the least." She looked at him steadily. "This time you weren't desperate. This time no one was threatening you. This time you woke up, picked up the phone, and sold me because $50,000 was sitting on the table and I was the most convenient thing you had to trade." His face did something complicated and unhelpful. "I have a problem," he said. "You know I have a problem. The gambling, it's not— I can't always— I know about your problem." She leaned forward slightly. "I have known about your problem since you were 19 years old, and I was 16 and you borrowed money from Mom's grocery fund and told her it was for textbooks. I have been knowing about your problem my entire life, Daniel. I have been covering for it and absorbing it and forgiving it and paying for it in every currency available to me." She paused. And you looked at everything I've been through in the last 6 months, and you decided I was still the most expendable thing in your life. That's not, you thought I had no value. The words came out flat and clear. You have always thought I had no value. That's why you picked me the first time. That's why you came back the second time. Because on some fundamental level, you have spent my entire life believing that I was the one in this family who didn't matter. The fat one, the dark one, the one who made bread and didn't make money and wasn't going to amount to anything impressive. She sat back. And I need you to know that the man you tried to use me against, the man you handed my life to a rival family to damage, is the only person in my entire life who has ever looked at me and not needed me to be different. Daniel's eyes were wet. She noticed this the way she'd notice a weather change, noted it, didn't reorganize herself around it. Amara, please, I'm not finished. She unfolded her hands and placed them flat on the table. I'm not going to let Cassian kill you. I made that decision before I came in here. Not because you deserve protection from me. You don't. But because I am not going to spend whatever time I have left on this earth carrying the weight of what happened to my own brother. I'm not doing that. She looked at him. But I'm going to do something. He waited. His eyes were doing the wet, sorry thing they did. She had seen this face her whole life, his face when he needed forgiveness, and she had always given it. You're going to leave, she said. New York, the state, the whole life you've been living here. You're going to take nothing from this family's name, nothing from any connection to us, nothing you didn't earn yourself before you walked into that first gambling room. She kept her voice completely even. Your bank accounts, the ones funded by anything adjacent to this arrangement, will be closed. Your connections in this city, the ones that depend on your relationship to the Moretti family, will be informed that you have no standing here. You will not contact me. You will not contact my husband. You will not come to my bakery or my home or appear in any proximity to my life. Amara, see, and if you do, she said, I won't be the one who stops Cassian. The room went quiet. Daniel's face had cycled through several things and landed on something that might have been the beginning of understanding what was actually happening. That this was not a negotiation, that this was not the version of this conversation where she softened at the end, that she had walked in here with a decision already made and was simply delivering it. You're serious, he said. It wasn't really a question. I have never been more serious about anything in my life. He looked at the table for a long time. His hands, she noticed, were shaking slightly. Good. She was glad they were shaking. She wanted him to feel the weight of what he'd traded away. I'm sorry, he said. She stood up. I know you are, she said. You're always sorry after. That's the one thing about you that's never changed. She walked to the door, knocked twice. Reyes opened it. She walked out without looking back. She made it to the end of the corridor before she had to stop and put one hand on the wall and breathe deeply, once, twice, 3 times. The way you breathe when you've been holding something very heavy for a very long time, and you have just set it down, and your arms are shaking from the release. Cassian was at the end of the hallway. He had not been in the room. She had asked him not to be. He had agreed, which had been its own thing. A man who could have overridden the request on the grounds that this was his house and his situation and his justice to administer, simply saying, okay. He looked at her now. He didn't ask how it went. He looked at her face and read it the way he read everything, quickly, completely, without needing it explained. He leaves by tonight, she said. Arrangements are being made. She nodded. She walked to where he was standing and she stopped, and they were close enough that she could see the particular quality of attention in his face, the way he was looking at her like someone watching a person he doesn't want to lose do something that costs them everything and carry it without bending. The Duvante family, she said. What happens now? His jaw tightened. That's being addressed. Tonight? Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. Come back, she said. Simple. Direct. No architecture around it. Something moved through his face. He reached up and touched her jaw. One hand, thumb at her cheekbone, careful in a way that had nothing to do with caution and everything to do with intention. I'll come back, he said. He left. She went to the kitchen and finished the laminated dough, because it still needed 2 more hours and the butter was going to break if she left it too long, and she was not going to let the pastry fail because of her brother. What happened that night, Amara learned in pieces. Not because Cassian hid it from her. He didn't, which was itself a thing she was still adjusting to, being with someone who defaulted to telling her the truth rather than managing her relationship to it. But because it happened in the dark across 3 different parts of the city simultaneously, and the picture assembled itself across the following 24 hours the way a photograph develops. Slowly, then all at once, and then you can't unsee it. The Duvante family had 4 primary operations in New York. 2 were legitimate, a property company, a restaurant group that served as a financial cleaning mechanism. 2 were not. Cassian dismantled all 4 in a single night, not destroyed in the crude sense, not fire and broken glass. Dismantled the way a surgeon dismantles something, precisely, along the natural seams, leaving no cut that wasn't intentional. The restaurant group's financial irregularities were delivered to 3 separate federal investigators before midnight, along with documentation sourced from inside the operation that had been accumulating, Reyes later told her, for 11 months. The property company's largest asset, a commercial building in Midtown held under 3 layers of shell companies, changed hands through a legal mechanism that Cassian's lawyers had been positioning for since August. By 2 in the morning, it was a Moretti asset. The 2 non-legitimate operations ended in ways that Amara didn't ask for details about, and Cassian didn't provide them, and she understood this as the edge of the territory they had agreed, without ever discussing it explicitly, she would not cross. Luca Duvante was found at 6 the following morning sitting in the lobby of a Midtown hotel, alone, without his security, without his phone, without any of the insulation that had surrounded him for the previous 11 years. He was alive. He was waiting, had apparently been waiting for several hours, for someone to arrive and tell him what the terms were. What arrived was a lawyer. What the lawyer delivered was a document outlining the terms under which Duvante would be permitted to leave New York and relocate to a city without a Moretti presence. The terms were specific. The consequences of non-compliance were described, in legal language, with a precision that left nothing ambiguous. Duvante signed. By 9 in the morning, he was on a plane. Amara heard all of this while standing at the kitchen counter drinking coffee that had gone cold, listening to Reyes give a summary that was thorough but professionally stripped of anything personal, and she thought about the fact that Cassian had built this response over months, had been building it since before the bakery attack, maybe before any of this, the way you build something you know you're going to need before you know exactly why you need it. "Where is he?" she said when Reyes finished. "On his way back." She nodded. She poured the cold coffee out and made fresh. He came in at 9:47. She heard the front door, heard Reyes' voice in the hall, heard footsteps that were unhurried but carrying the particular weight of someone who had been awake for over 24 hours and was running on something other than rest. She was at the table when he came into the kitchen. He stopped in the doorway the way he had on the very first morning she'd baked in this kitchen, all those weeks ago. The same frame, the same posture, the same quality of a man standing at the edge of a threshold, deciding whether to cross it. Except that his jacket was gone and his shirt was rumpled and there were shadows under his eyes that went deep, and he was looking at her with an expression that had nothing managed about it. She got up. She poured coffee into the mug she'd set out. She had set it out specifically because she had been waiting for him, and she wasn't going to perform ambiguity about that now. And she brought it to where he was standing. He took it. Their fingers didn't quite touch, and then they did. "Is it done?" she said. "It's done." She searched his face. She had learned over weeks how to read the layers of him, which stillness was peace and which was suppression, which silence was comfort and which was distance. She looked now and found something she'd never seen quite like this before. Not peace exactly. More like the particular exhaustion of a man who has been carrying a weapon for a very long time and has finally had a reason to put it down. "Come sit down," she said. He sat at the table. She sat across from him. He drank the coffee, actually drank it, didn't let it go cold, and she watched him and didn't say anything, and the kitchen did what it always did, held the quiet without making it heavier. "Vitelli called," he said after a while. "When?" "An hour ago." He looked at the table. He wanted to express his approval of how the Duvant situation was handled. A pause. "He also mentioned that his assessment of you had been revised." She absorbed this. Revised how? He used the word formidable. Something passed across Cassian's face that was not quite a smile but occupied the same territory. Coming from Vitelli, that is approximately the highest compliment available. "A cast-iron skillet and 2 peach pies," she said. "Apparently very formidable." He looked up at her. He also mentioned that a woman who could hold herself together in front of him the way you did, and then fight off a professional extraction team with baking equipment, was exactly the kind of person this family needed. She considered this. So he approves now. He approves now. Because I hit someone with a skillet. Because you didn't run. He said it differently, quieter, without the almost humor. Because when everything went wrong, you didn't collapse, and you didn't hide, and you didn't ask anyone to fight your battles for you. You fought with what you had, and you didn't ask permission. He was looking at her steadily. That's what they understand. It's the language they speak. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the kitchen windows, the morning had gone properly bright, the thin October light filling the yard in a way that made the grass look like it was made of something more valuable than grass. I faced my brother, she said. I said what I needed to say. I made the decision I needed to make. She looked at her coffee cup. It still feels, I don't know, not good. Not like I thought it would. What did you think it would feel like? Like something finished. She turned the cup in her hands. It doesn't feel finished. It feels like I just put something down that I'm going to have to keep choosing not to pick up. He was quiet for a moment. Then, yes, he said. That's what it feels like, every time. She looked at him. My father, he said, by way of explanation that wasn't really an explanation but was, for him, probably as close as he got to one. She nodded. She didn't push. She understood by now the specific grammar of what he was willing to say and how much silence went around each thing, and she had learned that the silence wasn't withholding. It was the rest of the sentence. They sat in the kitchen until the coffee was gone, until the morning went from early to regular, until the house, which had held the tension of the previous day. In its walls, the way old houses hold everything, seemed to release a breath. She got up and started making eggs because he hadn't eaten and she hadn't eaten, and whatever else was true, people needed to eat. She cracked 4 eggs into the pan and thought about Daniel on a plane somewhere, or in a car, or standing in the particular open space of a life with no map. She thought about the photograph on the restaurant table. She thought about the 16-year-old version of herself, who had covered for him so automatically it had become invisible even to her, the texture of a habit that runs so deep you don't notice it until it's gone and you can feel the shape it left. She thought about her grandmother's kitchen, Sunday mornings, the half song she could never remember in full. She was plating the eggs when Cassian said from the table, "Teach me something." She turned. "What?" "About baking." He looked slightly, not uncomfortable, but aware that he was in territory he didn't have vocabulary for. "Show me how to make something." She looked at him for a moment. Cassian Moretti, who ran the most feared organized crime family in New York, who had dismantled a rival empire between midnight and 9 in the morning, sitting at her kitchen table asking her to teach him to bake. "Something simple," she said. "Yes. Bread is simplest." "Then bread." She set the eggs on the table and went to the pantry for flour. She heard him get up and wash his hands at the sink without being told to, which meant he was paying attention, and she filed that away alongside all the other things she'd been filing about him since the first morning she'd stood at this counter and he'd appeared in the doorway. She measured flour into the ceramic bowl and handed him the wooden spoon, her wooden spoon, the one that wasn't decorative. "Start here," she said. He took the spoon. His hands were wrong for it. Too much pressure, the grip of someone used to things that required force, and she reached over and adjusted his fingers without thinking about it, the automatic correction of someone who'd been teaching people to handle dough for years. He looked down at her hands on his. She looked up at him. And the kitchen was warm and the October light was coming through the windows, and somewhere out there the bakery was opening and Mrs. Okafor was getting her tote bag, and the construction crew was lining up for sweet rolls, and Luca Devante was on a plane he couldn't come back from. And Daniel was somewhere being the person he'd chosen to be. And Amara Ellison was standing in a kitchen that had been cold when she arrived and was not cold anymore, showing a dangerous man with expensive hands how to hold a wooden spoon. "Like this," she said. "Like this," he said. And the morning continued the way mornings do when they are given the chance, forward, into light, without asking anyone's permission. What no one in the Moretti organization talked about openly, but everyone understood, was that the 3 weeks following the Devante resolution marked a shift that had no single visible cause and no announcement. It was the kind of shift that you noticed in retrospect, the way seasons change, not at a specific moment, but across a series of mornings that are each slightly different from the one before, until one day you look up and the thing has changed entirely. The men who came to the estate for meetings started acknowledging Amara when she moved through the house, not deferentially, not performing it, acknowledging, the way you acknowledge a person whose presence has weight. Reyes, who had been professionally cordial since day one, began consulting her on the household logistics that intersected with security, not because protocol required it, but because her observations about patterns, who came and went, what the rhythms of the property looked like from the inside, were useful, and he was not a man who wasted useful things. Vitelli came to the estate for dinner. She made pork roast and apple bread and a tart she'd been developing for weeks, and she served it in the formal dining room with Elena's help. And Vitelli ate everything on his plate and said, at the end, "The Ellison Bakery. I have been told the lemon tart is exceptional." "The curd needs low heat and patience," Amara said. "Most things do," said Vitelli. It was the most he had ever said to her that wasn't an assessment. She accepted it as the thing it was. The meeting was called on a Thursday morning in the 4th week of November. Full syndicate. The kind of meeting that happened twice a year at most, where every family head who operated under the Moretti umbrella sent a representative or came themselves. Cassian had been preparing for it for 2 weeks. She knew this from the quality of his mornings, the compressed efficiency of them, the way he ate quickly and moved through the house with the particular focus of someone carrying a complex thing in their head that required continuous background processing. She was not invited. She had not expected to be. She spent the morning in the kitchen making enough food for 20 people because the meeting was at the estate and someone was going to need to eat. At 10:45, Elena came to the kitchen doorway. "He's asking for you," she said. Amara looked up from the bread she was scoring. "The meeting isn't finished." "No." Elena's face was doing the controlled concern thing, a little more pronounced than usual. "There's been a development. He wants you present." She set down the bread knife, wiped her hands, followed Elena to the formal meeting room, which was a room she'd been in once before briefly, to understand its geography. Long table, high-backed chairs, walls that had seen a great deal of history they were never going to report. There were 11 men around the table. Cassian was at the head. He looked at her when she came in and something in his face settled. 1 degree, barely visible, the particular settling of someone who needed to know where a specific thing was and now knew. She took the empty chair that had been left, not at the foot of the table, but to Cassian's right, which was not an accidental placement. Vitelli, across the table, looked at her with the expression he'd been wearing since the night she'd called herself not a liability, something between assessment and its conclusion. The man to Cassian's left, Ferraro, she knew from the briefings Elena had given her, another family head, a man who had always positioned himself as the principal skeptic of this marriage, looked at her with considerably less warmth. "This is a family council," Ferraro said, not to her, to Cassian. "Yes," Cassian said. "She is not." "She is," Cassian said. The 2 words were quiet and final and carried the specific gravity of something that had already been decided and was not up for re-argument. Ferraro looked at him for a long moment, ran whatever calculation he was running, and sat back. Cassian looked around the table. "There is a situation that requires a decision from this council," he said. "It also requires the council to understand something that some of you do not yet know." She looked at him. He looked at her, briefly, directly, and then at the room. "The intelligence that allowed us to resolve the Duvant situation did not come exclusively from our own surveillance network," he said. "It came, in significant part, from information provided by Amara. Observations about patterns. Timing inconsistencies she flagged in the bakery surveillance before the attack. A detail about the security shift change that she noticed and reported that allowed us to identify the source of the leak before the attack escalated further." She held very still. She had not known he was going to say this in a room with 11 people in it. "She is not a civilian component of this family's administration," Cassian said. "She is an active participant in its security and its interests, and I am asking this council to recognize that formally." The room was very, very quiet. Vitelli was looking at her. His expression was, for the first time in her experience of him, entirely unguarded. And what was in it was not skepticism. It was the face of a man updating an assessment in real time. Ferraro's face was something else. She watched him look at Cassian, then at her, then at Cassian again. And she watched the calculation running behind his eyes. Not the simple math of approval or disapproval, but something more complicated. A man reevaluating the landscape because one of the fixed points in it had just moved. "You're asking us to formalize the Queen's position," Ferraro said, slowly, like he was testing the shape of the sentence. "I am telling you what it already is," Cassian said. "The formalization is courtesy." Ferraro looked at Amara directly. His eyes were not warm, but they were serious. The eyes of someone who was not performing an opinion, but forming one. "The bakery incident," he said to her. 3 men. 3, she said. "Professional." That's what Cassian said. They didn't seem very professional once the flour hit their eyes. Something passed around the table. Not laughter. Something quieter and more genuine than that. The particular sound of people who don't surprise easily being slightly surprised. Ferraro looked at her for another moment. Then he picked up his coffee cup and looked at Cassian. "The formalization," he said, "is noted." It wasn't enthusiasm. It wasn't warmth. It was the acknowledgement of a man who had run the math and found it balanced. And in this room, at this table, that was worth more than enthusiasm. Cassian looked at her again. The same look as when she came in. 1 degree settling. The specific relief of someone who needed a thing to land right and was watching it land. She met his gaze and held it, and in the space between them, across the formal table in the room that had seen a great deal of history, something passed that needed no words. And the meeting ended at noon. The men filed out the way men like these always filed out, without small talk, without the particular social lubrication of people who needed each other to like them. They had what they'd come for. The business was done. Ferraro was the last to leave, and he paused at the door. Not to speak, just to look at Amara one more time with the expression of a man who was still updating his files. And then he was gone too, and the room was empty except for her and Cassian and the remains of the morning's coffee and the particular silence of a space where something significant had just occurred. She sat in the chair to his right and looked at the long table and didn't say anything for a moment. "You should have warned me," she said. "You would have told me not to do it." "Yes. That's why I didn't warn you." He was still at the head of the table, not leaning back, not relaxed exactly, but with the quality of a man who had just put down something heavy and was noticing the absence of the weight. It needed to be said in that room. It needed to be said in front of them so that it couldn't be unsaid later. She turned the coffee cup in front of her. Empty. She turned it anyway. "Ferraro," she said, "will fall in line. He respects outcomes." The outcome of the Duvant situation was not ambiguous. "Vitelli." Already there. Something at the corner of his mouth. "He told me last week that you reminded him of his mother. I chose not to pass that along immediately." She looked at him. "His mother. Apparently she once threw a pot of boiling water at a man who came to collect on a debt." He paused. He meant it as the highest possible compliment. She exhaled slowly. Not quite a laugh. Something that lived in the same neighborhood. She stood up. She straightened her chair the way she always did. Automatic. The habit of someone who had spent years making sure her space was in order before she left it. She walked to the door and then stopped because there was something still sitting in her chest that needed to come out before she could go back to the kitchen and her bread and the ordinary motion of the afternoon. She turned around. "When you said I was an active participant," she said, "when you said that in front of all of them." She looked at him across the long table. "Did you mean it as a political statement, or did you mean it?" He looked at her for a moment. The question was clear and he understood it was clear, and she could see him deciding not to dress it up. "Both," he said, "but the second more than the first." She nodded. She turned and went back to the kitchen. The bread needed another 20 minutes. She set the timer and stood at the window while she waited and watched the November yard. The grass had gone the color of old straw, and the trees had finished losing their leaves, and everything out there had the stripped, honest look that late autumn had, where the landscape stopped performing and just was what it was. She thought about the woman she'd been the morning Daniel came to her apartment. Flour on her hands at 6 a.m., the honey oat loaves for the 7 o'clock order, the specific smallness of the life she'd been living. Not bad, not unhappy, but small in the way things are small when you've accepted a ceiling that someone else built. She thought about the car ride, the gravel drive, the enormous cold bed. She thought about sitting on the floor of the memorial room while a man who hadn't let anything reach him in 5 years sat in a chair and told her his dead wife would have liked her, and the way that sentence had landed in her like something that wasn't supposed to grow but was going to anyway. The timer went off. She took the bread out of the oven, and it was good, and she knew it was good before she touched it because she had been reading bread since she was 7 years old, and some knowledge lives in the body before it lives anywhere else. December came in cold and deliberate. The bakery on Carver Street put a pine wreath on the door that Marcus had found somewhere and hung with electrical tape because he didn't trust thumbtacks on old wood, and Amara came in 3 mornings a week now. Not every day, but enough to keep her hands in it, enough to keep the recipes honest. She was training 2 of the new staff on the croissant technique, which was not something she had ever been able to teach quickly because croissants did not reward impatience, and most people under 30 had a complicated relationship with processes that could not be accelerated. On a Tuesday morning in the second week of December, she was demonstrating the lamination fold for the 3rd time, showing Cassian, who was 23 and talented and deeply frustrated by how long this was taking, when she felt it. Not dramatically. Not the way things happen in stories, just a sudden, very clear nausea that arrived with the authority of something that knew exactly what it was. She set the dough down, pressed the back of her hand to her mouth, breathed through her nose. Cassian looked at her. "You okay?" "Fine." She wasn't sure that was true. "Keep the dough moving. If you stop, the butter seizes." She went to the back, sat on the step stool near the dry storage shelf, put her head in her hands, and did the arithmetic that she had been quietly, privately, not quite doing for the past 2 weeks, because doing it would make it real. The arithmetic resolved clearly in the back of her bakery on a Tuesday morning in December, sitting on a step stool with the smell of laminated dough in the air. She sat there for a while. Then she got up and went back to the front and showed Cassian the fold again, because the croissants still needed to be made and the world was still turning, and she was, as she had always been, a person who kept moving. She told Cassian on a Wednesday evening. She had planned, briefly, to find a particular way to do it, a moment, a context, something that gave the information the weight it deserved. Then she decided that performing a moment was not something she was interested in, and that the best version of telling him was the one where she just told him. He was in the study. She knocked. He said, "Come in." She came in and sat in the chair across from the desk, the same chair she'd sat in when Reyes brought the photograph of Daniel, the chair that had acquired a specific gravity. And she looked at him. "I'm pregnant," she said. He went very still. Not the controlled stillness, not the armored stillness. A different kind. The kind that happens when the body receives information that requires it to recalibrate everything. He looked at her for a long time without speaking. She watched his face, and she saw it. The thing she'd been watching move closer and closer to the surface of him for months. The thing grief had buried and time had not been able to fully excavate, and she had somehow, accidentally, persistently managed to reach. She watched it arrive in his face fully, for the first time, without the architecture he usually built around it. His eyes went wet. He didn't look away. "How long?" he said. His voice was different, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with control. 7 weeks, maybe 8. He nodded. He was doing something with his jaw, working it slightly, the way people do when they're managing something that is larger than the space they're trying to keep it in. She waited. He got up from behind the desk. He came around it and he crouched in front of her chair the way he had crouched on the ballroom floor. That same gesture, low and deliberate and eliminating the distance between them on purpose. And he took both her hands. He didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at their hands. Her hands, which were not small or delicate, which were flour-roughened and scarred along the right thumb from a bread knife in 2021, and had a permanent ghost of cinnamon under the nails no matter how carefully she washed. He looked at them the way you look at something you are registering as precious in real time, the moment the value reveals itself. "Are you all right?" he said. "I'm good." She squeezed his hands once. "I was nauseous in the bakery this morning. Cassian thinks I'm getting sick." "You should rest." "I'm not going to rest more than I already rest." "Amara." "I'm not an invalid. I'm pregnant." She looked at him. His face was doing so many things she'd never seen on it before. She was cataloging them, filing them, these new expressions she didn't have names for yet. "Are you all right?" He made a sound that was not a laugh and not a sob, and was something that lived between them. The sound of a person who has been in one emotional register for so long that encountering a different one produces something the body doesn't have an established channel for. I didn't know if I was going to... He stopped, started again. After Elena, I didn't think this was going to... He stopped again. She reached forward and put one hand on the side of his face. The gesture surprised him. She could feel the slight flinch of someone not accustomed to being touched with uncomplicated tenderness. And then he leaned into it. I know, she said quietly. She didn't know the specifics of what he was trying to say. She didn't need to. She understood the shape of it. The particular grief of someone who has lost a future and spent years believing that specific future was the only one available, and then discovered, slowly and against their will and better judgment, that they were wrong. They stayed like that for a while. Him crouched in front of her chair, her hand on his face, the study quiet around them with its documents and its history and its ongoing administrative reality that was going to be there tomorrow and could wait. January. February. The estate changed the way the bakery had changed. Not in the large visible ways, not in a renovation or a redecorating, but in the texture of daily life. Small accumulations. The kitchen counter had her things on it permanently now, no longer a temporary encampment, but an established geography. The room that had been hers was still hers, but was no longer separate. It had become the room where she kept her clothes and her books, connected to a larger pattern of movement through the house that didn't have a formal name, but that everyone in the house understood. The memorial room in the west wing remained as it was. Photographs on the walls, the cleared shelves, the chair in the corner. Cassian still went there sometimes. She knew because the house told her, the atmospheric pressure shifting in that particular way. She didn't go with him, and she didn't ask him not to go. The room was what it had always been, a place where something irreplaceable was held, and she had long since stopped thinking of it as something she was competing with. You didn't compete with a dead woman. You didn't compare yourself to a ghost. What Cassian had had before was real and gone, and what he had now was real and present, and those two things could both be true without one canceling the other. She had figured this out around month 4, sitting in the kitchen at 5 in the morning with her hands around a cup of tea she wasn't supposed to drink too much of, listening to the house breathe. Some things don't replace each other. They stack. She thought her grandmother would have had a way of saying that with flour involved somehow. Something about layered dough, maybe. How the layers didn't erase each other. They created something together that neither layer could be on its own. March arrived, and with it the particular quality of light that came before real spring. Not warm yet, not committed, but with a brightness that was different from winter, the sense of the world reconsidering. She was 7 months along by March. The fact of this was impossible to ignore, and she had stopped trying to move through the house as though it weren't true, which meant her mornings now involved a negotiation with her own center of gravity that was ongoing and occasionally humiliating, and that she had decided to approach with the same practical attention she brought to bread that wasn't rising right. You assessed the problem. You adjusted the approach. You didn't get sentimental about it. She still came to the bakery twice a week. Marcus had taken over the morning management entirely now, which she had initially resisted and then accepted because Marcus was excellent, and the bakery was better with him running it, and admitting that someone else could run her thing well was its own kind of growth. She still baked every morning at the estate. This was non-negotiable. She had said so to Cassian, to Elena, to the doctor, who had looked at her with the expression of a person about to recommend reduced activity, and none of them had pushed back once they understood that this was not a preference but a fact of her constitution. Cassian had started appearing in the kitchen earlier, not later, earlier. He'd been rearranging his schedule, she understood, not in the way people rearrange schedules by announcement, but in the quiet way of someone who has reprioritized without needing to explain why. He was at the table by 6 most mornings now. Sometimes he read documents. Sometimes he watched her work without pretending he wasn't. Sometimes he helped, in the limited but genuine way of someone who had been learning a skill for 4 months and had achieved competence without quite achieving fluency. He could make bread now, real bread, edible and honest, even if it was never going to have the quality of something made by someone whose hands had been doing it for 20 years. She had told him once that the bread you made yourself always tasted better than it actually was. He had said that was true of most things. She thought about that sometimes. On the first morning of what felt like real spring, The light different, the air different, the particular quality of a season committing. She was at the counter shaping rolls when she became aware that he was not at the table but standing behind her, closer than the table. She kept shaping. "You're hovering." "I'm standing." "You're hovering. You've been hovering since Tuesday." "You dropped a bowl on Wednesday." "I dropped a bowl, not myself." She pressed the heel of her hand into the dough. "I have been dropping things my entire life. You watched me fall at our own wedding." "I watched you fall at our own wedding, and then I watched you fight off 3 men with kitchen equipment, and now you are 7 months pregnant and shaping bread rolls at 5:40 in the morning, and I am standing nearby, which is my right." She turned around. He was, in fact, very close. She looked up at him. He was always going to be significantly taller than her. This was a permanent feature of their landscape. And she looked at his face, which was doing the thing she'd come to think of as his version of openly worried, which on anyone else would have been just a facial expression, but on him was the equivalent of visible distress. "I'm fine," she said. "I know. The baby is fine. I know. You don't have to stand behind me while I make bread." "I know." He didn't move. She turned back to the counter. She shaped 2 more rolls. She was aware of him standing there, and she was not actually annoyed, which was the thing she wasn't going to tell him, because she had spent 27 years in a world where the people who were supposed to be watching out for her were consistently watching out for themselves instead. And the experience of having someone simply stand there, not to control, not to manage, just to be near because the alternative was less acceptable, was something she was still learning to receive without deflecting. She let him stand there. She shaped the rolls. He stood behind her. The kitchen was warm and the bread was going to be good, and outside the March light was coming up early and committed. The baby arrived in April. Not easily. Nothing about it was easy. 12 hours that Amara later described to Elena as the most effortful 12 hours of her life, which was saying something given the competition, and which Elena received with the expression of a woman who had watched this house endure a great deal and was quietly grateful to be watching something come into it for once. Cassian was present the entire time. She had not specifically requested this, and he had not specifically asked permission. He was simply there, which was what he did, occupied the space where he decided he was needed, and did not move until the thing requiring his presence was resolved. He held her hand during the parts that required it. He did not offer commentary. He did not try to make it lighter or better or more manageable. He simply held on, and she squeezed, and he let her without flinching, which she would remember specifically later, the not flinching. The baby was born at 4 in the afternoon on an April Tuesday, the same day of the week as the bakery attack, which she noted and decided to interpret as reclamation. A girl. She was small and loud and entirely herself from the first 30 seconds, which Amara had been told was not universal, but was, she suspected, very specifically the kind of child she and Cassian were going to produce. Cassian held her with the focused attention of a man who was aware that he was holding something that mattered more than everything else he had ever held, and that he needed to do it right, and who was also aware that right, in this context, was not something he could calculate in advance or control through preparation. He held her the way you hold something irreplaceable, carefully, with both hands, not because you're afraid of it, but because you understand what it would cost to drop it. He didn't speak for a while. He looked at this small, loud, entirely herself person in his arms, and his face was doing the things it had been doing since December, the unarchitected things, the expressions she'd been cataloging and hadn't finished cataloging yet, and suspected she wasn't going to finish for a long time, which was fine, which was more than fine. "She has your mouth," he said eventually. "She has your forehead," Amara said. "I don't think that's Cassian. She has your forehead." He looked at the baby. At her forehead specifically. Something happened in his face that was not argument. "We'll see," he said. She did in fact have his forehead. They named her Vera. Not after anyone. Not after his first wife. Amara had waited to see if he would suggest it, and he hadn't. And when she asked him why, he said simply that Vera was her own person and deserved a name that wasn't carrying anyone else's weight. She had thought that was right. She had thought it was also, in its quiet way, something significant. A man who had built a room to hold his grief, choosing, deliberately, to let new things have their own names. Vera was 3 weeks old when Amara first brought her to the bakery. She had not planned to. She had gone in on a Wednesday morning to check on the croissant training. Kezia had been working on it for 2 months, and there was a specific issue with the final fold that Marcus had texted her about on Sunday. And she had Vera in the carrier because Elena was off, and Cassian was in a meeting, and this was simply what you did when you had a 3-week-old and needed to go somewhere. She came in through the back, and Marcus looked at her, and then at the carrier, and his face did the thing it had done when she came back the first time, after the estate, after everything. The pure, uncomplicated relief of someone seeing a person they needed in the specific place they belonged. Croissant problem, she said. Second fold, he confirmed. She went behind the counter with Vera strapped to her chest, and she looked at what Kezia had done and identified the issue in about 45 seconds, and spent the next 20 minutes showing her the correction, one-handed, because the other hand was doing the periodic reassuring check on the small warm weight against her chest. The customers started coming in at 8. Mrs. Okafor came through the line, got her usual, and stopped in front of Amara at the counter and looked at Vera in the carrier with an expression of absolute uncomplicated joy. "Look at her," Mrs. Okafor said. "Look at this baby." "Her name is Vera," Amara said. Mrs. Okafor reached out and touched Vera's cheek, very gently, the tip of one finger. Vera's face did the involuntary thing newborn faces did, a twitch, an adjustment, a small animal registering contact. "She's going to run this neighborhood," Mrs. Okafor said. "She might run considerably more than that," Amara said. Mrs. Okafor looked at her with the expression of a woman who had been buying bread on Carver Street for 4 years and had watched this particular baker survive things she hadn't told anyone the half of and understood without needing details that the woman in front of her had landed somewhere she'd earned. "Good," Mrs. Okafor said. "Good." Summer came. The estate in summer was a different place than it had been in October. The same geography, the same stone, but with the particular warmth of a house that was being lived in, genuinely lived in, which was not a quality that could be manufactured or decorated into existence. It came from use, from the kitchen being warm every morning, from voices in rooms, from a baby in a house built for silence learning, day by day, that silence was optional. Vera was 3 months old and conducting a vigorous ongoing negotiation with the concept of sleeping through the night, which was not going well for anyone. Amara was up at 2:30 on a Saturday when she heard footsteps in the hallway, not hers, heavier, and then the sound of the nursery door, which was 3 rooms from hers, opening and closing quietly. She lay in the dark and listened. Silence. The particular silence of someone being very quiet. Then, after a few minutes, Vera stopped the preliminary sound she'd been making that had woken Amara, the sounds of a small person deciding whether to fully commit to waking up, and went quiet. Amara lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling. In the morning, when she came to the kitchen at 5:30, Cassian was already at the table. He looked like a man who had not slept, which was true, but he was reading a document with the focused attention of someone who had decided that being awake was going to be productive and was following through on that decision. She didn't say anything about the nursery. She started the bread. He looked up after a few minutes. She was almost awake. "I heard." "She went back down." "I heard that too." He looked at his document. She shaped the dough. The kitchen was warm, the way it always was now. The warmth not of temperature specifically, but of occupation. The warmth of a place that knew it was being used. "I used to come home to this house," Cassian said, without looking up from the document. "And it was the same every time, same rooms, same temperature, same quality of silence." He paused. "I didn't know I had been living in a preserved thing until it stopped being preserved." She kept her hands in the dough. "She did that," he said. "My wife." He said the word without the particular quality it used to have. Still weighted, still real, but the weight different now, the weight of something carried rather than something dragged. "She made the house different from what it was when I grew up in it. And when she was gone, it went back to what it was. And I let it. I thought—" He stopped, turned a page of the document without reading it. "I thought that was the right thing to do. To keep it as it had been when she was in it." "I know," Amara said quietly. "You didn't leave it that way." She was quiet for a moment. "I couldn't. I don't know how to be in a place without changing it." "I know." He set the document down. Looked at her across the counter. "I'm glad." She looked at him. In the early morning light, the specific quality of 5:30 in the summer, the light coming through the east windows pale and full of possibility. He looked like the person she had been slowly learning he was underneath the person everyone else knew. The architecture was still there, the discipline, the authority, the particular way he occupied a room. But underneath it, consistently, reliably, was a person who had come to the nursery at 2:30 in the morning so that she could sleep. "I should have told you," he said, "earlier than I did." She raised an eyebrow. "Told me what?" "That you were... that I..." He stopped, made the face he made when the words weren't coming in the shape he wanted. "That the house was better." She waited. "That I was better," he said, more quietly. "After you." She pressed her palms into the dough, felt the give of it, the resistance, the way good bread dough pushed back against you before it yielded. "You could have told me sooner," she said, "but I think I knew." "When?" She thought about it. "The lemon curd temperature," she said. He looked at her. "You sent a note to Marcus about the oven temperature for the lemon curd." "A week after I got here. You didn't have to do that. Nobody asked you to. You did it because I mentioned it and you were paying attention." She looked at her hands in the dough. "Nobody had paid that kind of attention to anything I said in a very long time." He was quiet. "That's when I knew it wasn't just going to be the thing it started as," she said. "A note about lemon curd. That was it." He looked at the table for a moment, then he looked at her. "Efficient," he said. "Well?" She turned the dough. "I'm a baker. We work with what's available." The syndicate meeting in September was the largest one in 11 years. Every family head came in person. The room was full in a way it hadn't been since before Cassian's first wife died, since before the years that had calcified the Moretti family in grief and made them formidable in the way that things which have stopped growing are formidable, dense, cold, immovable. Amara sat to his right. This was no longer notable. It had ceased to be notable somewhere around May, the way things cease to be notable when they occur consistently enough to become fact. She sat to his right, and Vera was with Elena in the estate's east wing, and the morning bread was in a basket in the center of the table because she had made it that morning, and there was no reason for it to go uneaten. Vitelli took a piece of bread at the start of the meeting. He did this without comment, without ceremony, with the ease of a man who had decided that the bread at Moretti meetings was a fixture. Ferraro took a piece 11 minutes later, which was his version of unconditional surrender, delivered with such casualness that it could not be called surrender except by someone who knew him well. She watched this. She kept her face still and her hands in her lap and her posture even. And she thought about a 6 a.m. in October a year ago, when she'd been standing in a hotel room while strangers arranged her hair for a wedding she hadn't chosen, looking at a version of herself in a mirror that had been curated for someone else's approval. She thought about the gravel drive, the cold house, the dough she'd made at 5:30 the next morning because her hands needed to know where to go. Cassian was speaking, some administrative matter, a territorial question, the ongoing business of running an empire. And she was listening with the part of her mind that was always listening now, the part that had been learning this language for a year and had achieved, if not fluency, then at least honest competence. She caught his eye across a moment in the meeting. A brief thing, 1 second, maybe less. The look of two people in the same room who have a different relationship to what's happening in it than everyone else in the room, the look of two people who share a private geography in the middle of a public one. He held it for a moment. Then he looked back at the room. She looked back at the bread in the basket. One of the captains, a large, quiet man named Costa, who had never once in her experience spoken to her directly, reached forward and took a piece and ate it with the unconscious comfort of someone who had decided he was at home. She thought, this is what it looks like. Not the end of something, not a destination. This is what it looks like when a thing is simply, steadily, continuing. She thought about her grandmother's kitchen, the half-song she'd been trying to remember for 20 years. The particular smell of Sunday mornings, yeast and warmth, and the specific safety of a place that knew you were in it. She had spent 27 years believing the ceiling was where other people put it. She had spent the year since believing, slowly and against the evidence of everything that had come before, that a ceiling was only permanent if you agreed not to push on it. She had pushed. The ceiling had turned out to be a door, not an easy door, not a door that opened smoothly or without cost. A door that had required her to walk through an arranged marriage, and a cold mausoleum of a house, and a ballroom full of cruelty, and a brother who sold her twice, and 3 men in her kitchen on a Tuesday morning in October. A door that had cost her the smallness she'd made her peace with, the low ceiling she'd learned to move under without noticing it was low anymore. She had walked through it anyway, with flour on her hands and a cast-iron skillet and the specific stubbornness of someone who had been told she wasn't quite right her whole life, and had spent 27 years being right anyway, in the privacy of her own kitchen, where the bread always rose and the lemon curd set perfectly at the right temperature, and the thing she made was good because she had made it. She picked up her coffee cup. Cassian's voice continued, steady and authoritative and carrying the particular quality it had now. Still the voice of the ghost. Still the voice that had made 400 people hold their breath in a ballroom, but with something underneath it now that hadn't been there a year ago. Something that had been buried under 5 years of grief and discipline, and the particular armor of a man who had decided loss was the price of caring and had responded by stopping. Something that sounded, if you were listening for it, and she was always listening for it, like a man who had not stopped, like a man who had found, in the last and most unexpected direction, a reason to keep going. The meeting continued. The bread in the basket went slowly, piece by piece, until it was gone. Outside the estate windows, the September light was doing the thing it did at this time of year, golden and a little slanted. The particular angle of light that knew summer was ending and wasn't apologizing for it. The kind of light that made everything it fell on look like what it actually was. No more and no less. The honest light of a season that had stopped trying to be anything other than itself. She sat in it. She let it fall on her hands, her face, the table in front of her. Amara Ellison, who had been sold by her brother and mocked by a ballroom, and who had fought professional kidnappers with peach pies, who had sat on the floor of a memorial room and not left, who had written a note about lemon curd temperatures and rebuilt a cold house from the inside out, who had faced her brother across a table and set him down like the weight he had always been. The woman who had walked into a mausoleum with flour on her hands and bread in the oven and had, without meaning to, without a plan, without anything except the specific stubbornness of someone who knew how to make something good from whatever was available, turned on every light. The meeting continued. The bread was gone. The light held.